We almost lost both of them. The doctor's voice echoed through the sterile hospital corridor, low and controlled, but carrying a weight that made even the most seasoned nurses pause for a fraction of a second, as if the words themselves had gravity. Inside room 418, machines hummed in steady rhythm, their soft beeping the only sound filling the space where Clara Bennett lay motionless against stark white sheets, her skin pale under the fluorescent lights, her dark hair damp and clinging to her temples as though she had fought something invisible and exhausting for hours. Just beyond the glass partition, a tiny incubator glowed softly in the neonatal unit, where a newborn struggled quietly, too small, too fragile, yet somehow holding on. Outside the room, the hospital staff moved with practiced urgency, exchanging clipped updates, their voices professional, but their eyes betraying concern. No one noticed how the nurse hesitated before writing a name on the chart, how she paused just long enough to reread it twice, as if confirming it wasn't a mistake. Adrian Wolf. The name didn't belong in this place. Not here, not in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion, not attached to a situation this messy, this personal. 6 months earlier, Adrian Wolf had signed the final divorce papers in a glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, his signature clean, decisive, final in a way that left no room for hesitation or regret. At 42, he had built Wolf Industries into a multi-billion-dollar empire, the kind of success that came with headlines, interviews, and a reputation for precision. People trusted Adrian Wolf to make decisions that mattered, to calculate risks down to the smallest detail, to see outcomes before they happened. His life operated on control, on structure, on the understanding that every variable could be accounted for if you were sharp enough, disciplined enough, detached enough. Divorce had been just another decision. Necessary, logical, clean, or at least that's what he told himself. Back in the present, the hospital hallway felt different from the world Adrian knew, slower in some ways, heavier in others, as if time stretched just enough to let every uncertainty breathe. The doctor glanced once more at the chart before turning to a colleague. She insisted, he said quietly, his tone carrying a note of something almost reluctant. She gave only one name. The colleague frowned. And he hasn't been contacted yet. The doctor shook his head. Not yet. But he will be. Somewhere across the city, far removed from the quiet tension of the hospital, Adrian Wolf stood in his corner office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished floors as he reviewed a contract worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. His focus was absolute, his posture relaxed but precise, the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His phone rested on the desk beside him, silent for now, just another tool in a life defined by efficiency. He didn't know that, at that exact moment. His name had just been written into a story he thought he had already closed. He didn't know that the past he had neatly categorized and left behind had quietly rewritten itself without his permission. And he definitely didn't know that, within the next hour, everything he believed about control, about certainty, about his own life, was about to be challenged by a single sentence delivered in a calm, professional voice. Back in room 418, Clara's fingers twitched faintly against the sheets, a small movement that might have gone unnoticed if not for the nurse adjusting the foreline. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Whatever strength had carried her this far had already been spent, leaving only silence behind. The nurse glanced again at the chart, at the name written there in clear, careful letters, and for a brief second, she hesitated. Because something about this didn't feel simple. Something about this felt like the beginning of a complication no one in this building was prepared for. And as the machines continued their steady rhythm, one truth hung quietly in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Someone had made a decision, and soon, Adrian Wolf would have to answer for it. The phone rang at exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, a precise interruption that cut cleanly through the quiet efficiency of Adrian Wolf's office. And for a brief second he considered ignoring it, because unknown numbers rarely brought anything worth his time, but something about the persistence of the call made him glance down, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly before he answered, his voice calm, controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms when millions of dollars were on the line. And yet the voice on the other end did not belong to his world. It was softer, professional, carrying a kind of careful urgency that did not ask for permission to be heard. It simply existed. And it said his name in full, Adrian Wolfe, as if confirming his identity before crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. And when he responded with a short acknowledgement, the woman introduced herself as a doctor from St. Mary's Medical Center. And in that instant something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that his grip on the phone tightened just slightly, because hospitals did not call him, not without reason, not without consequence. And then came the sentence, delivered evenly, almost gently, as if the tone could soften the impact of the words themselves. She has named you as the father. And for the first time in years, Adrian did not respond immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, before he exhaled slowly and said that there must be some mistake, because he had been divorced for 6 months, because timelines mattered, because facts mattered, because his life did not allow for errors like this. But the doctor did not argue. She simply stated that the patient had listed no one else, that the situation was urgent, that both the mother and the child required attention, and that he was the only contact provided. And the simplicity of that fact landed harder than any accusation, because it was not emotional, it was not dramatic, it was procedural, and yet it carried implications that Adrian could not immediately dismiss, his mind already moving, calculating, tracing back through months that he had already categorized and closed, searching for any possibility, any explanation that fit within the logic he trusted, and still finding gaps where certainty should have been. He ended the call with a promise to arrive, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully decided on them. And for a moment he remained standing there, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass, his reflection faint against the city he had mastered. And yet none of that control followed him into what he was now stepping toward, because somewhere across that distance, a woman he had once known better than anyone had made a decision that pulled him back into a story he believed was finished. And as he reached for his jacket, his movements precise but slightly faster than usual, one question settled quietly beneath everything else, not loud, not panicked, but persistent in a way that refused to be ignored. What had he missed? And more importantly, why had she never told him? And as the elevator doors closed behind him, the answer remained just out of reach, waiting on the other side of a hospital room he had never planned to enter again. By the time Adrian Wolfe's car pulled up to St. Mary's Medical Center, the city had shifted into evening, the golden light fading into a colder glow that reflected off the glass entrance. And for a moment he remained seated, his hand resting on the door handle, not out of hesitation but calculation, as if stepping out of the car would confirm something he was not yet ready to accept. And when he finally moved, everything about him returned to precision, his posture straight, his expression composed, the same controlled presence that had built his reputation. Yet as he walked through the automatic doors, the atmosphere changed immediately, the scent of antiseptic, the quiet urgency of staff moving past him, the low hum of machines somewhere deeper inside. None of it belonged to his world, and yet it was pulling him forward with a momentum he could not ignore. At the reception desk he gave his name, and the reaction was subtle but noticeable. A brief flicker of recognition followed by a quick shift into professionalism, as if his identity carried weight even here, and within seconds a nurse appeared, guiding him down a long corridor where each step seemed to narrow his focus further, until the outside world no longer existed, until there was only the question waiting at the end of that hallway. When they stopped outside room 418, the nurse paused, her voice softer now, explaining that the patient was stable but exhausted, that the situation had been complicated, that he should keep the visit brief. And Adrian nodded once, though his attention had already moved past her words, settling on the door in front of him, because beyond it was Clara Bennett, a name he had not spoken in months, a person he had deliberately placed in his past, and yet now she was here, connected to him in a way that defied the clean separation he had insisted on. He pushed the door open slowly, and the sight inside was not what he expected. Clara looked smaller somehow, her usual composure replaced by a stillness that felt unfamiliar, her face pale against the white sheets, her breathing steady but shallow, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking in the reality of her presence, because this was not a memory, not a reflection of what used to be. This was now. This was real. and it carried consequences he could not yet define. Her eyes opened gradually, as if she sensed him before she fully saw him, and when recognition settled in, it was not relief that crossed her expression, not surprise, but something quieter, more guarded. As if his arrival confirmed something she had already anticipated. "You came," she said, her voice weak but steady, and Adrian stepped closer, his tone controlled, almost measured, as if choosing each word carefully could maintain the order he depended on. "You listed me as the father. What did you expect?" The question hung between them, direct and unfiltered, and Clara held his gaze for a long second before answering, not with emotion, not with explanation, but with a simple truth. "Because you are." The words landed with a weight that was impossible to ignore, and Adrian felt something shift again, not visible, not dramatic, but undeniable, his mind immediately searching for logic, for a framework that made sense. "Is he mine?" he asked, the question sharper now, more urgent. Beneath the surface, and Clara did not look away. "Yes," she said quietly, and the certainty in her voice left no room for doubt, no space for denial. And yet it created a new question, one that pressed harder than the first. "Why did you not tell me?" Clara's expression changed slightly, not defensive, not apologetic, but resolute in a way that suggested the answer was not simple. "Would you have believed me?" she asked. And Adrian did not respond right away, because the truth was not as clear as he wanted it to be, because the end of their marriage had not been calm or understanding. It had been distant, fractured, built on silence more than conflict. And somewhere in that silence, something had been missed, something that now stood between them in the form of a child neither of them had planned to discuss. And before he could press further, Clara turned her head slightly, her voice softer now, almost tired. "There is more you do not know," she said, and in that moment, the certainty Adrian relied on began to unravel just enough to reveal something deeper beneath it, something that suggested this was not just about a child, not just about a past mistake or a hidden truth, but something larger, something that had been kept from him deliberately. And as he stood there, the distance between what he believed and what was real had never felt wider. Adrian did not answer her immediately, because the words "there is more you do not know" did not sound like an explanation. They sounded like a warning, and he had spent his entire life recognizing the difference, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied Clara's face, searching for any sign of uncertainty, any hesitation that might give him leverage. But there was none, only a quiet steadiness that made him realize she had already decided how much she was willing to say, and how much she would keep to herself. "You do not get to decide what I know," Adrian said finally, his voice low but firm, the controlled authority returning as if it could re-establish the structure he relied on. "If this involves me, if that child is mine, then I am not leaving this room without answers." Clara closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, not in defeat, but as if gathering what little energy she had left, and when she opened them again, there was something different there, not resistance, but caution. "You think this is about control," she said quietly, "but it is not. And that is exactly why I did not tell you." Adrian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, because the implication in her words challenged something fundamental. "You are saying you kept this from me on purpose?" he asked, and she did not deny it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Despite her condition, I did." And for a moment the air between them shifted, the tension sharpening into something more precise, more personal, because this was no longer about possibility, it was about intention, about a choice she had made that directly affected him. "You do not get to make that decision alone," Adrian replied, each word deliberate, measured, "because you are not the only one this affects." Clara's gaze held his, unwavering even now. "I was the one carrying the consequences," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only fact. "You walked away from everything, Adrian, clean and certain. You made it very clear you wanted nothing that tied you back to me." The words landed harder than he expected, not because they were loud or emotional, but because they were accurate in a way that left no easy defense. He remembered the final meeting, the papers spread across the table, the agreement structured down to the smallest detail, no shared assets, no ongoing obligations. A separation designed to eliminate complications. At the time it had felt necessary, efficient, but now that same clarity felt incomplete. as if something had been missing from the equation, something neither of them had fully acknowledged. "You could have told me," he said, though the certainty in his voice had softened slightly, and Clara's response came without hesitation. "And what would you have done?" she asked, her eyes searching his face not for an answer, but for honesty. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have treated it like everything else, something to analyze, something to resolve, something to remove?" Adrian did not respond immediately, because the question forced him into a space he did not like, one where logic did not provide immediate answers, one where the past could not be rewritten with better decisions. And before he could find a response that satisfied him, a quiet knock interrupted the moment, a nurse stepping in with careful efficiency, checking Clara's monitors, adjusting a line, her presence a reminder that time in this room was limited, that this conversation could not stretch indefinitely. "She needs rest," the nurse said gently, her tone respectful, but firm, and Adrian stepped back slightly, not because he wanted to, but because he recognized the boundary. Yet as he turned toward the door, Clara spoke again, her voice softer now, but carrying enough weight to stop him. "You should see him," she said, and Adrian paused, his hand still on the edge of the door, the words settling slowly, deliberately, because until that moment, the child had been an idea, a possibility defined by statements and questions, but now it was something real, something waiting just beyond this room. And as he glanced back at Clara, searching for any sign that this was a test or a manipulation, he found none, only quiet certainty. And for the first time since the call, Adrian felt something unfamiliar rise beneath his control, not doubt, not fear, but something closer to hesitation, because once he stepped into that next room, whatever distance remained between his past and his present would disappear completely. The hallway outside the neonatal intensive care unit felt quieter than the rest of the hospital, as if even sound respected the fragile lives behind the glass, and Adrian Wolfe slowed his pace without realizing it, his usual confidence replaced by something more measured, more deliberate, because this was no longer a conversation he could control with words or logic. This was something he had to see, something that would either confirm or dismantle everything he thought he understood. A nurse greeted him at the entrance, her expression calm but observant, as if she had already seen variations of this moment play out many times before. She asked for his name, checked a chart, then gave a small nod and gestured for him to follow, explaining in a quiet, steady voice that the baby had been born early, that his condition required monitoring, that everything was stable for now but still delicate. The words were clinical, precise, but Adrian found himself focusing less on the explanation and more on the reality forming beneath it, because each detail made the situation less abstract, more immediate. When they stopped beside a softly lit incubator, the nurse stepped aside slightly, giving him space, and for a moment Adrian did not move, his gaze fixed on the small form inside. It was almost difficult to comprehend at first. The baby was so small, wrapped carefully, surrounded by gentle mechanical support. Yet there was something undeniably present, undeniably real, a life that existed independent of his expectations, independent of his control. He stepped closer, slower now, as if any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile balance in front of him. The nurse spoke again, her tone softer. "You can touch him. Through here," she said, indicating the small openings designed for careful contact. Adrian hesitated briefly, not out of fear, but because this moment carried a weight he could not calculate. Then he reached forward, placing his hand cautiously through the opening, his fingers brushing against the tiny hand inside. And the reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his, and something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that bypassed logic entirely. Adrian felt it before he understood it, a connection that did not ask for proof or explanation. It simply existed. He studied the child more closely now, searching without realizing it. And there it was, a small detail, a resemblance not obvious enough to declare, but strong enough to suggest: the shape of the brow, the faint line of the nose, details that felt familiar in a way he could not dismiss. The nurse watched quietly, then added, "He is stronger than he looks." And Adrian nodded slightly, though his attention remained fixed, because the idea of strength here was different from anything he had known. It was not measured in numbers or outcomes. It was measured in persistence, in the quiet determination of something that refused to let go. After a moment, the nurse stepped back, allowing the silence to settle again, and Adrian withdrew his hand slowly, as if breaking contact required intention, stepping back just enough to take in the full scene once more. And for the first time since the call, the question of whether this was real no longer existed. It was real, undeniable, and it carried implications he could not ignore. As he turned slightly, his mind already beginning to move again, not in denial, but in calculation of a different kind, he glanced toward the chart attached nearby. Noticing that part of the information had been restricted, certain details marked in a way that suggested deliberate limitation, and that detail stood out immediately, because information was not something that simply disappeared. It was something that was controlled, managed, hidden when necessary. And as he looked back at the child, then toward the hallway, leading back to Clara's room, a new question formed, sharper than the others. If this was the truth she had given him, then what was the part she was still keeping hidden, and why did it feel like someone else had been involved in making sure it stayed that way? Adrian did not leave the neonatal unit immediately. Even after the nurse stepped away and the quiet hum of the machines settled back into the background, because something about what he had just seen refused to fit neatly into the structure of his thoughts. And as he stood there, his eyes moved once more to the chart beside the incubator, the section that had been partially restricted, the subtle notation that indicated limited access, and that detail lingered in his mind longer than anything else, because in his world information was currency, and when something was hidden, it was rarely accidental. He reached for his phone, his movements calm but deliberate, and within seconds he was connected to his assistant, his voice low, controlled. I need full access to all records at St. Mary's Medical Center connected to Clara Bennett, and the newborn admitted today. No delays, no restrictions. And there was a brief pause on the other end. Not confusion, but recognition of the tone he used when something mattered beyond routine business. It will be done, his assistant replied, and Adrian ended the call without further explanation, slipping the phone back into his pocket as his attention shifted again, this time not to the child, but to the pattern forming around the situation, because Clara had not just hidden the pregnancy. She had also ensured that certain details remained inaccessible, and that required effort, planning, possibly help, and that possibility introduced a new variable, one he could not ignore. He turned and left the unit, his pace steady, his expression once again composed, but beneath that surface his thoughts were moving faster now, connecting fragments, testing assumptions. When he returned to Clara's room, the atmosphere felt different, quieter, as if the earlier tension had settled into something more restrained. She was awake, her gaze already on the door as he entered, as if she had been expecting him to come back, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the distance between what had been said and what had not was now more significant than anything else. You saw him, she said finally, her voice softer than before, and Adrian nodded once. Yes, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation. Clara watched him carefully, as if trying to read what he was not saying, and when he did not elaborate, she spoke again. He is stronger than they thought. Adrian stepped closer, stopping just beside the bed, his gaze steady. They are not telling me everything, he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Clara's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but acknowledgement, because she understood exactly what he meant. They are telling you what they can, she replied, her tone measured, and Adrian's eyes narrowed just enough to signal that the distinction mattered. Who restricted the information? He asked, and this time there was a pause, longer than before, because the answer was not something Clara could dismiss or deflect easily. You are already looking into it, she said instead, and that was not a denial. It was confirmation. Adrian exhaled slowly, his mind aligning with the implication. This is not just about you deciding not to tell me, he said, his voice quieter now, but more focused. Someone made sure I would not find out. Clara held his gaze, and for a moment the room felt smaller, more contained, because the truth was beginning to take shape between them. Yes, she said finally, and that single word carried more complexity than anything else she had said. Adrian absorbed it in silence, because it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. This was not an accident. Not a simple choice made in isolation. There was intention behind it, structure, possibly influence. And that shifted everything. Because now the question was not only why she had kept the truth from him, but who had helped her do it, and more importantly, why. He studied her for another moment, searching for any sign that she would say more, but Clara remained still, her expression calm but guarded, as if she had already revealed as much as she was willing to give, and that meant the rest he would have to uncover himself. Adrian straightened slightly, the familiar sense of control beginning to return, not because he had answers, but because he now had direction. Then I will find out, he said, and Clara did not stop him, did not argue, because something in her expression suggested she already knew he would, and as he turned toward the door once more, the situation had shifted again, no longer defined by shock or uncertainty, but by something more precise, more dangerous, a hidden truth that had been carefully managed, and a man who did not accept limits when it came to finding it. Adrian did not go back to his office that night. Even though his driver waited outside and his calendar had been cleared with quiet efficiency, because something about leaving now felt like stepping away from a problem before understanding its full shape, and that was not something he allowed himself to do. Instead, he moved through the hospital with the same controlled focus that had built his empire. But this time his attention was not on deals or numbers, it was on patterns, on inconsistencies, on the subtle signs that something had been deliberately managed. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, and when he checked it, the message from his assistant was brief but precise. Preliminary access granted, restrictions confirmed, flagged by internal authorization, and beneath that, a name, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present in a way that immediately drew his attention. Dr. Leonard Hayes. Adrian paused mid-step, reading it again. Because the name was not unfamiliar, it belonged to someone with influence, someone connected to private networks that did not operate within standard protocols, someone who did not make decisions without purpose. And that alone shifted the situation from personal complication to something more calculated, more intentional. He turned without hesitation, heading toward the administrative wing of the hospital, his pace steady but purposeful, because if someone had inserted themselves into this, then there was a reason, and he intended to find it. When he reached the office listed under the name, the door was partially open, and inside stood a man in his late 50s, composed, observant, the kind of presence that did not need to assert authority because it already existed. Dr. Hayes looked up as Adrian entered, his expression neutral, but not surprised, as if he had been expecting this moment to arrive eventually. "Mr. Wolfe," he said calmly, his voice measured. Adrian stepped inside, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. "You restricted access to information regarding Clara Bennett and the child," he said, not wasting time on introductions. Dr. Hayes did not deny it, nor did he offer immediate explanation. Instead, he studied Adrian for a moment, as if assessing not just the question, but the man asking it. "Some information required discretion," he replied, and Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Discretion is not your decision to make in this case." Dr. Hayes remained composed. "That depends on the circumstances," and for a brief second, the tension in the room shifted, becoming less about authority and more about intent. Adrian took a step closer, his voice lower now, more focused. "What circumstances justify keeping this from me?" And this time Dr. Hayes did not respond immediately, because the answer was not simple, not something that could be delivered without consequence. Finally, he spoke. "Not everything that affects you is meant for you to control, Adrian." The use of his first name was deliberate, subtle, but enough to signal familiarity beyond a typical professional interaction, and that alone raised another question, one Adrian did not voice yet. "You are assuming this is about control," Adrian replied, his tone steady. "It is about truth and right. Now, I am being denied it." Dr. Hayes exhaled quietly, as if weighing something internally, before responding. "You are being protected from it." The words landed differently than expected, not defensive, not confrontational, but intentional, and Adrian's expression did not change, though his thoughts shifted again. "Protection implies risk," he said, and Dr. Hayes met his gaze without hesitation. "Exactly." And for a moment the silence that followed carried more weight than anything spoken, because the situation had moved beyond hidden information, beyond personal decisions, into something that suggested a larger structure, a reason strong enough for someone like Hayes to intervene. Adrian's voice remained calm, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now. What risk? He asked, and Dr. Hayes held his gaze, the answer forming slowly, deliberately, because once spoken, it would change the direction of everything. The risk is not what you think it is, he said, and Adrian did not interrupt. Because he recognized the shift, the moment before something significant is revealed, Dr. Hayes continued, it is not about the child. And as those words settled, Adrian felt the foundation of his assumptions begin to shift again. Because if this was not about the child, then the question that followed was far more complex, far more dangerous. Then what is it about? He asked quietly. And Dr. Hayes did not answer immediately, his expression steady, controlled, as if choosing the exact moment to say it mattered just as much as the words themselves. Because once you understand, he said slowly, there is no going back, and the implication behind that statement lingered in the air, unresolved, waiting. As Adrian realized that whatever truth had been hidden from him was not just personal, it was something that could redefine everything he thought he knew about the past he had already closed. Adrian did not look away from Dr. Hayes, even as the weight of those last words settled into something heavier than anything he had heard so far. Because this was no longer about confirming a fact or uncovering a hidden detail. This was about understanding why someone with no personal stake in his life had chosen to intervene, and more importantly, what that intervention was protecting or preventing. Explain it, Adrian said, his voice calm, but leaving no room for deflection, and for a moment, Dr. Hayes remained silent, his gaze steady, as if measuring how much truth Adrian could handle at once. Before finally speaking in a tone that was quieter, more deliberate, Clara did not just decide to keep this from you. He said, she was advised to. And that single clarification shifted everything again, because it removed the idea of a purely personal decision and replaced it with something coordinated, something guided. Advised by who? Adrian asked immediately, his focus sharpening, and Dr. Hayes exhaled slowly, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement that the next part mattered. By people who understood the implications better than she did at the time. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. Implications of what? He pressed, and Dr. Hayes stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to ensure privacy. Of your position, your influence, your exposure. The words were precise, chosen carefully, but they only deepened the confusion, because Adrian had built his life around those exact elements. They were not secrets. They were foundations. You are going to have to be more specific, Adrian replied, and Dr. Hayes studied him for another moment before continuing. 6 months ago, when your divorce was finalized, there were already discussions happening around you. Not about your company, but about you personally. People watching, evaluating, waiting for any vulnerability that could be used. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, because that was not entirely new information, but it had never intersected with something this personal before. And Clara was considered a vulnerability, he said, more as a realization than a question, and Dr. Hayes nodded once. Yes, and when her pregnancy became known to certain individuals, the situation changed. It was no longer just about a private matter. It became a potential leverage point. The word leverage landed with precision, because Adrian understood exactly what that meant in his world. It meant pressure, manipulation, outcomes controlled by information rather than actions. So someone decided the best solution was to keep me unaware, Adrian said, his tone still controlled, but the edge beneath it more defined now. Dr. Hayes did not argue. They decided it was safer for everyone involved, especially the child. Adrian let that settle for a moment, processing the logic behind it. Even if he did not agree with the execution, and Clara agreed to this, he asked, and Dr. Hayes's response came without hesitation. She did not have many options. The answer was simple, but it carried implications that were far more complex, because it suggested pressure, influence, decisions made under circumstances Adrian had not been present to understand. And for the first time since entering this situation, his focus shifted slightly, not away from control, but toward context, toward the possibility that Clara's silence had not been as absolute a choice as he had assumed, and yet that only raised another question, one that moved beyond the past and into the present. If this was about protection, Adrian said slowly, then why tell me now? Dr. Hayes's expression changed slightly, not uncertainty, but recognition of the question's importance. Because the circumstances have changed, he replied, and Adrian's gaze sharpened immediately. In what way? And this time Dr. Hayes did not soften the answer, because whoever was watching before, they are no longer waiting. The implication was clear. The situation had shifted from observation to action, from potential risk to something more immediate. And as that realization settled in, Adrian understood that whatever had been hidden from him was no longer just about the past. It was about something happening now, something already in motion, and for the first time, the question was not just what had been kept from him, but what was coming next. Adrian did not respond right away, because the idea that something was already in motion did not create panic in him. It created focus, a narrowing of attention that stripped away anything unnecessary until only the essential questions remained: who was watching, what they wanted, and how far they were willing to go. His gaze remained fixed on Dr. Hayes, but his mind had already moved ahead, mapping possibilities, identifying pressure points, and most importantly, determining where the real vulnerability existed. Because if this situation had shifted from passive observation to active intent, then the target was no longer just potential. It was present, and that meant the risk had already escalated beyond what had been planned. Where is the exposure point? Adrian asked quietly, his voice steady, but carrying a sharper edge now. And Dr. Hayes did not pretend to misunderstand. The child, he said, without hesitation, not because of who he is now, but because of what he represents. Adrian absorbed that instantly, not emotionally, but strategically, because in his world representation meant leverage, identity meant access, and access meant influence. Someone knowing about the child was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty, and the only question left was how that information would be used. How many people know? Adrian asked, and Dr. Hayes shook his head slightly. Not many, but enough. And that was the problem. Enough meant unpredictable variables. Enough meant something had already slipped beyond control. Adrian's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign that the situation had crossed into territory he did not tolerate. Then the priority changes, he said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision, because whatever had been planned before was no longer sufficient. The structure had shifted, and he would adjust accordingly. Dr. Hayes studied him carefully, as if anticipating that reaction, and then nodded once, because he understood exactly what Adrian was capable of when something mattered. You are not wrong, he said, but you should understand something. This is not a problem you can solve the way you usually do. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Everything has a structure, he replied, and structures can be broken or reinforced. The question is which one you choose. And Dr. Hayes allowed a brief pause before responding, because that choice is not entirely yours anymore. The words lingered, not as resistance, but as a warning, and Adrian did not dismiss it, because for the first time in years, the variables in front of him extended beyond his direct influence. But that did not mean he would step back. It meant he would move differently, faster, more precisely. He turned without another word, already knowing what his next steps would be, because information had shifted into action, and action required response. As he walked back through the hospital corridors, the quiet tension felt different now, no longer uncertain, but defined, each step carrying purpose as he moved toward the neonatal unit once again, because before anything else, he needed to confirm what mattered most. When he reached the glass partition, his eyes went directly to the incubator, to the small figure inside, unchanged from before, yet now carrying a significance far beyond what he had initially understood. This was no longer just about a hidden truth. It was about a point of leverage that someone else had already identified, and that alone made the situation unacceptable. Adrian stepped closer, his reflection faint against the glass as he looked down, and for a moment, the calculated precision that defined him shifted into something quieter, something more grounded, because no matter how complex the situation became, the reality in front of him was simple. This child existed, and now that he knew, there was no version of this where he stepped away. Not anymore. His phone vibrated again, and this time the message was shorter, more urgent. We have a breach, external inquiry flagged, and beneath it, a name, one he recognized instantly, not from business, but from something older, something tied to a part of his past he had not considered relevant until now. Adrian's expression did not change, but something inside him aligned with absolute clarity, because whatever had been set in motion was no longer hidden. It had surfaced, and as he looked back at the child, then at the name on his screen, one realization settled in with certainty. This was never just about a secret being kept from him. It was about someone who had been waiting for the moment it would finally be revealed.